I've always been drawn to darker fantasy stories when I watch movies or TVs, or, I feel like life is not all roses and pretty and everything, and there's darker sides to things, and really shows the deep emotions that we feel. And even though it's dark fantasy, like you can get those same emotions from regular fantasy, but I feel like with dark fantasy, it's more real.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I'm your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I will be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. Welcome to episode 7 of the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am Herman Stuernagel, and today I'm talking to YA author Kimberly Grymes, all about YA dark fantasy. I wanted to know how the elements of dark fantasy, which is traditionally, surprise, surprise, dark, meshes with a subgenre that is directed at young adults. We talk about how she works these themes together seamlessly. We have a great interview. Kimberly also discusses how she develops characters and her world in her upcoming book, Shades of Light. The book comes out next month, but it is up for pre-order now, so stick around for that conversation, and of course I will have all of her links in the show notes. As far as a personal update goes this week, there's a lot going on. First, if you have been at all interested in checking out my book Eclipse, it is on sale for this week only, which is the first week of September when this goes out. It's on sale for 99 cents in the Kindle store on Amazon, and I'll of course link that down in the show notes for you. The book is also on a book tour through Escapist Book Tours. If you want to check out some reviews and blog posts about the book, make sure to check out Escapist Book Tours on their social media platforms, or you can follow my writer Instagram account, which is at Herman Stuernagel. I'll be sharing everything that comes through this week, and those will of course be linked in the show notes as well. Additionally, if you want to do a read-along of Eclipse with someone, my friend Tatiana over at the Bookish Banter podcast is hosting a buddy read-along for the entire series starting this week. I will link that in the show notes as well. They are starting this week, so be sure to join them, and she will be wrapping it all up with an interview with me in October, where we'll be discussing the first 2 books, Eclipse and Chimera, on her podcast. Check that out. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you want to hear a conversation that I had with Tatiana back in, I believe it was February, you can find that on her show as well. We had a great chat, and I'm sure we will have another great chat next month. Otherwise, my advanced copies of Chimera will have hopefully gone out by the time this episode airs, and I am really excited to see what readers have to say. It has been a long time in the making. It's crazy that it will finally be heading out to readers in preparation for the launch in October. I've been also updating and setting up pre-orders for the hardcover version and getting the final touches done. There's lots of work to do this week, and it is going to be crazy. What I am reading this week is Iron Gold by Pierce Brown. This is the 4th book in the Red Rising series. I read the initial Red Rising trilogy years ago, and I never continued on with the series, but now that the 7th book, Lightbringer, is out, I decided it's high time for me to continue on with it. I'm about halfway through Iron Gold, and I'm loving it so far. I was afraid it would have lost some of the magic of the original trilogy, but it definitely has not. If you're a fan of dystopian work set in space, check it out. It is one of my favorite series, and there's definitely been some inspiration from that series to be found in my Fractured Orbit series. All right, let's get to the interview. I will read Kimberly's bio, and we'll get started. Kimberly Grymes is a multi-genre author of young adult books who loves being sucked into science fiction, fantasy, mystery, and paranormal worlds. After many, many years of reading books and watching other people's stories on TV and film, she finally took the plunge and started writing and sharing her own stories. When she's not writing, she's either hanging out with her family, watching movies or TV shows, reading a good book, or creating new designs and products for her Etsy shop. She and her family live on the outskirts of Wichita, Kansas, with her 2 crazy miniature pinchers, Corey and Jubilee. Let's get to the interview. So, welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I have a very special guest with me today, Kimberly Grymes. I know her through a number of writing groups that we are in, and I am very excited to have her on the show this week. Welcome here, Kimberly.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this new podcast journey you're starting.
Yeah, I'm obviously excited too, and I'm glad that you agreed to join me today. So, Kimberly, why don't you tell our guests a little bit about your writing journey and what's brought you to this point in your author career?
So I actually started my author career a little bit later in my life. I didn't actually start reading until my mid 30s, mainly because as a kid I didn't really read a lot. I have a learning disability with grammar and punctuation, and so it was just really discouraging for me and frustrating. But then Twilight came out, and everyone was just so excited about this book, and I was like, I'm just going to read this book. So I jumped on, I read this book, and I fell in love with books, and I just started devouring Cassandra Clare and a lot of books, and that's when I was like, I want to write stories regardless if it's a struggle for me or not. And so I just started writing.
That's a great story to have. I mean, we hear so much of authors who have been reading since they were out of the womb and have
Yeah.
loved writing, and that sort of thing. It's good to hear a story of someone who is, started that journey a little bit later on. I know I think Shane was the same way. He wasn't a big reader until later on as well, and that's what got him propelled into writing. So, how long have you been writing for, and how many books do you have out currently?
So I've been writing for about 10 years,
Okay.
and the first book I wrote is called Isildas, and it took me about 8 years to write, mainly because, like I said, it was a real struggle for me to just grasp the whole writing process, but I was so determined. I really worked hard at learning the craft and how to structure a story and everything. So
Right.
it took me 8 years to publish the first book. And then since I'm a very quick learner, and so it took me 2 years to write book two, which I recently published. In the meantime, I also published a companion novella in that world. I also wrote three short stories and published them in three different anthology books, one being The Rebel Diaries with Sasha Black, which is our writing group.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll we'll talk a little bit about your stories as well coming up because I'm interested to hear. I don't think I realized there was such a difference in the time you took to write book one to book two. So I do want to know a little bit more about that. First, though, tell me about the why in your writing. So you read Twilight and you loved it. Now, and obviously you decided to keep going with your writing journey. You put out a couple of books and you're still going. So what's your motivation now?
The why I write is basically because I love getting lost in story worlds, whether it be in a book, a movie, a TV show, or just listening to somebody tell me a story about, an adventure they took or a vacation. I just
Right.
love hearing stories. When I was a kid, I would just find anything around the house just to play and make up worlds. And now, as an adult, being an author, I get to kind of do the same thing except just with books. And so I love doing that, and so that's why I write.
Yeah, so I want to get back. I didn't, and I know I didn't prep you for this question, so I apologize. But I do want to hear a little bit more about the difference, in your process between your first book and your second book, because a lot of authors take way longer with their first book than they do with their following books. So you went from that book to book two, and I believe you have another book coming out later this year. So obviously your
Mhm.
process has changed. So how did that first book prep you for ongoing books, I guess?
Well, the first book, like I said, I was basically going back to, the drawing board and learning how to do everything. So it took some time, but once I
Right.
grasped the story structure and the character development and everything, it was easy for me to form a writing process. And so when I was writing book two, for my science fantasy, young adult science fantasy story, um, it was easy for me to just plot. I was a pantser with the first book.
Right.
And after watching a lot of like Abby Emmons and everything, I was like, you know what? I'm going to start plotting everything out. And so I'd written the three short stories because I was trying to learn how to get as much information in a story in a short. like 10,000 word or for short stories. And that forces you to put only the vital information for your story in a short story. And
Right.
so that's what I was trying to do, was try to learn how to condense and really just get to the point of the stories when I was writing the short stories. And then I used that for writing book two of my young adult science fantasy story. And I used
Nice.
that same process for going into the book coming out in October, Shade of Light.
That's fantastic. So I guess how do you come up with your stories? Obviously, you're this one. You're finishing up your duology. You have a couple more out. Where do you get your inspiration from?
Well, I've kind of taken a little bit of a pivot in my genre. When I wrote the short stories, the Rebel Diaries was more of a rebel character, and then I wrote a short story for an anthology book, Kingdoms of Wrath and Ice, which was more about morally gray characters and villains. And so that's when I really found myself. I really found myself as an author. I found my author brand. I liked and enjoy writing those darker fantasy stories, but for YA readers. So
Right.
I would just come up with more stories from there after that. It hit me.
I talked to A. Kincaid the other day. We recorded that episode. I'm not sure where in the progression it will air, but her novel was also inspired by that Rebel short story as well. So I think that's fantastic that Sasha has brought together authors that and inspired them to really find the story that they wanted to write through that anthology process.
Yes, it's great. She is great. That's how we met, and
Yeah.
we now talk a lot and bounce ideas off of each other, and that's all about this author community. It's so wonderful. Everybody just really supports each other and helps each other and answers each other's questions. So I love that part too.
I do too. It's great to have that community that we can relate to. So what other authors have inspired you in your writing?
Well, when I first got bitten by the book bug, it was mainly like Cassandra Clare, Bella Forrest, Kresley Cole, Jennifer Armentrout. But then when I started branching out into the indie community a little bit more, I wanted to focus in on connecting more with indie authors who inspired me. And so I started following Liz Delton, Sasha Black, Abby Emmons, and Bethany Adazada. They really know how to market. And that's
Right.
kind of the hardest thing about this indie author gig. So following authors who are doing it well really helps.
Definitely, and for those who maybe aren't familiar with those names, I mean, I recognize. I think all of them. They all are part of either the BookTube community. I know, like Abby Evans has a big YouTube channel, and Bethany does as well, and then
Yep.
with a couple podcasts in there. So yeah, similar to me when I got started, finding those voices that you could get inspiration from and figure out how to navigate the independently published author world was uh,
Yeah,
was difficult to do. So it was nice to have those voices out there.
definitely.
Yeah. So can you tell us a bit about your upcoming book, Shade of Light? It'll be coming out in a month or so. Can you tell us what it's about?
Yes. So I am super excited about Shade of Light. It is book one in the Three Shades trilogy. Originally, it was going to be a standalone book, but as I got to the end, I just really felt like this story had so much more to grow and tell. So I made it into a trilogy.
Nice.
And basically, the story follows an 18-year-old girl. Her name is Adele, and she has the ability to infiltrate people's minds with just the touch of her hand. And so the story starts off with her escaping from Castle Forge, and she'd been there held against her will comfortably, not like in a dungeon or,
Okay.
under duress, uh, by this treacherous General Annika. And so the general has been forcing Adele to interrogate people by torturing them when forcing them into this mental prison that she can do. And she forces them to relive their most fears and traumatic experiences over and over again. And so basically, the story is about her escaping this castle and heading back to her childhood village where she wants to get answers from her aunt, and she wants to know her past, why she is the way she is. She believes she's cursed. And so the journey takes her to her childhood village. And when she gets there, the village is under attack by the same attackers who attacked 8 years ago, which is when Adele had got lost in the woods and then she was kidnapped and brought to the general's castle. And she's been there ever since. But so it's a story about discovering her past and trying to deal with who she is right now and the things she can do, and it's about, she believes she's cursed and a monster, but yet,
Yeah.
does she have to do these evil things? So she learns that these attackers in her childhood village have the same ability as her, which raises more questions about who she is and her past. And, so she has to decide whether to stay and help the village and learn more about these attackers, or go back to the castle where she was held captive, because the one person who befriended her there is still there. So it's a story about choice and a story about, discovery, and there are some tropes in there. I guess we'll talk about tropes in a second.
Yeah, we'll get to tropes soon. Yeah, and I've been following, your marketing for Shade of Light on social media, and I know you talk about the monster within, and that hook has grabbed me anyway. So it sounds super interesting. So I want to know too, what was the inspiration behind this series? It's you've written your duology, you got that finished off. Were you working on this? Well, I guess two separate questions. Were you working on this at the same time as your second book in the it's Faunus was the second book in your last series, correct? Yeah. So were you working on it at the same time, and what was your inspiration behind this series?
I was working on Shade of Light while writing Faunus. It was kind of my back burner work in progress because we all have back burner,
Yes.
multiple projects we're working on. And so eventually I decided I really wanted to, like I said, it was going to be a standalone, just something just an exercise I was really doing, was because I really wanted to work on my character voice as a writer.
Okay.
So that was probably the inspiration of doing this, is because I was doing it more as an exercise to narrow down my cast of characters and really work on distinction between them with different personalities and different character voices. But then it kind of grew into, no, I really want to write this. And I really want to focus more on writing morally great characters, because I had written the short stories and I was like, this is going to be a
Yeah.
thing. So that is where it stemmed from.
Very cool. Very cool. So can you tell us a little bit more about dark fantasy and what dark fantasy is? Because I know that you, like you said, you're delving into the realm of morally great characters and a little bit darker. So what is dark fantasy, and how would you define it?
This was a big question for me too when I
Okay.
pivoted, because there's dark fantasy, there's gothic fantasy, there's lots of different, fantasy subgenres within
Yeah.
fantasy, and I wasn't sure, but I do know that dark fantasy doesn't mean horror or gore.
Okay.
I am definitely not a fan of horror or gore, especially for YA readers. Um, but it doesn't mean it's absent, because there are some authors out there who might include that. So for me personally, I don't think that horror and gore um, should be in dark fantasy. I think
Okay.
Adele's ability to infiltrate people's mind for torture, and I think that was what tipped my decision for this to be a dark fantasy story. Plus, it's in a world with demons and angels, and the demons get pretty nasty. So I kind of felt it was on the line of like the TV shows of like Stranger Things or
Okay.
Wednesday or Vampire Diaries, and so
Right.
that's why I was like, why a dark fantasy?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's interesting, and that I am, it's one of those subgenres that you hear tossed around a lot. That I didn't, I don't particularly know what defines a dark fantasy, and that's part of the reason of my questioning in this is, what are these subgenres about? What drew you to dark fantasy for this series? Other than what you've already talked about, And what aspects do you find most compelling and inspiring for this series in particular?
I think I've always been drawn to darker fantasy stories when I watch movies or TVs or,
Mhm.
I feel like life is not all roses and pretty and everything, and there's darker sides to things, and I feel like it really shows the deep emotions that we feel, and eh, and even though it's dark fantasy, like you can get those same emotions from regular fantasy, but I feel like with dark fantasy, it's more like real.
I mean, so you're exploring kind of the, like you said, not really the horror element of things, but it's really
Yeah.
more just morally gray, more of a kind of a mental darkness as well. Like people really
Yeah.
trying to find like what the
About
dark side of them
acceptance.
is.
Yeah, about acceptance. Like if you're one way and people don't accept you because you're this way, it's like you want to show them that just because I'm this way, I can still, be included. And I feel like that's important stories to tell um in fantasy ways. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and being allowed to go a little bit darker allows you to explore some of those not so pretty elements of life that we, might have to deal with in our real world, but in a fantasy world that we can maybe feel a little safer in exploring those ideas in.
yeah, definitely.
What do you think? I mean, I think we just touched on this a little bit, but what do you think appeals most to readers about dark fantasy? Because, like we said, it does seem to be a really popular subgenre right now. What do you think the draw is?
I like the realism of it, the pain. I think internal conflict or, the physical happenings that are going on in the story. I think depending on the level of, sensory description and overall story description, because you can have very subtle things, which is more likely in YA writing, whereas in adult fiction, you're allowed to get into detail a little bit more, into the graphic areas, but with YA fiction, you focus more on just very subtle, but still, I mean, if there's stabbing, because it's medieval time, medieval story and Shade of Light. So,
So, did you have a hard time finding that balance between YA and dark fantasy? Is there, were there certain lines that you had to make decisions about crossing or not, to keep it as a young adult book?
I learned a lot about writing YA from my first duology series, um, which I applied to the new YA dark fantasy series, the Shade of Light series. When I wrote the first series, I had my characters were older, and there wasn't any like violence or anything, but there was a lot of cursing in book one, and so I got some feedback in regards to, YA, it's YA. I mean, I personally feel like teenagers curse, whatever. But I guess it wasn't really accepted. I don't know. So I just took
Okay.
it for what it is, and then I learned there's definitely a difference between YA writing style and adult writing style. And that also goes for dark fantasy. I mean, if you take that show Wednesday and you make it more like Sweeney Todd, you're changing the age category.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the world of Shade of Light, and how did you go about creating it?
So Shade of Light takes place in a medieval fantasy world, but not so much as like castles with knights and squires. It's more like the outskirts with the villages, and it's just that where there's no technology. It's just that old world feel. Swords, bows and arrows, and everything. And the story, like I said, the fantasy element is demons and angels, where I feel like a lot of fantasy elements, they can be fae, they could be vampires, or those kind of paranormal creatures. So I really wanted to let the readers know ahead of time that this is a demons and angels fantasy world, which also means
Yeah.
that there's doorways to other realms. There's So that is also involved in the world building here.
Okay.
So it starts off as a really small world from Adele's perspective, and as the story goes and her character develops, she starts to realize how much bigger this world is.
Nice. So does that continue on into the into the next books in the series as well? Then does that world just kind of keep expanding for her?
It does. So book two, we're announcing the title. I'm announcing the title in September, I believe, and then the cover reveals November 1st for book two.
Okay.
And so Shade of Light is actually a dual POV story. There's two points of views, Adele, and then there's a few chapters from a character named Rune. And so later in book two, Rune becomes more of a an equal point of view.
Right. Yeah, and you don't have to get too far into
I
book
know, I'm
two because
like,
that's
no
probably.
spoilers.
But I mean, I love when book one kind of starts off as a small world perspective, and then as book one progresses, it gets a little wider, and then you get into book two and book three, and that world just continues to open up. That's one of my favorite things about one of my favorite tropes, I guess, and I'm not sure if there's a name for that trope, but I do
Oh
enjoy
no.
that. So what was the most difficult thing for you in creating this world?
Well, world building in general is I don't struggle with it, but I try to keep it as familiar as possible. Um, I don't go too crazy with new elements or new because you can create like a dark fantasy world. Like if you take the Avatar movies and you make them a dark world, there's a lot of elements in those worlds where you have to make sure that they affect the characters, what's their purpose for the story. And so that's just that's a lot. That's a lot. And so I'm working towards building on stories like that. For now, I keep things as familiar as possible for the reader, and choosing,
Okay.
a medieval fantasy world where a village is a village and arrows are arrows. It's easier as a writer, and as for the reader to really get into this world with these characters.
Yeah, because if you're not having to learn a lot about how the world operates, you can focus more on getting to know the characters
Yes.
and what their struggle is. Yeah, that makes sense. So who's your favorite character in this series?
So in Shade of Light, I mean, Adele is definitely a fantastic character just because I put so much into uh, molding her character voice and her personality and everything throughout. Because, I wanted to make sure her voice never fell flat, and I didn't stray and she didn't feel two dimensional. So she really, holds a place in my heart just because we really bonded over the year. But for a favorite character, I have to say his name is Elijah, and he is
Okay.
literally the sweetest guy. He's 17. He is the sweetest guy in the story, but he's also so strong and protective, and he's loyal. And I just love the dynamic between him and Adele. He's like this soft, friendly guy, and she's just this, I've got a wall up, stay away from me, don't come too close to me. So I really enjoy the dynamic he brings.
So is he a main character? I know he's not a POV character, but is he a main character in the story or is he a side character?
No, he's kind of a main character. He's there throughout all three
Okay.
books, and he's part of the Scooby Crew, whatever they're Scooby Doo crew.
Very cool. Do you have and I know I didn't ask you this, Cindy, this question either, but what's your process for creating your characters? Do you have a certain method that you use, or do you kind of get to know them as you write?
I do have a process for when I come up with a character. The first thing I usually do is find an actor or an actress on a movie or a TV show who I want my character to kind of role model after. And then I just really watch them and I take notes about like little things they do, their behaviors, their body language. Um,
Right.
and just how they speak, and then I just kind of take those notes, and I don't really focus too much on physical appearances until I actually start writing.
Okay.
But yeah, it's more or less, the small details that really help bring the reader closer to these characters, and so I find them on a TV show or movie.
That's great. I do that to some degree myself in some of my, at least some of my recent writings. I have an actor in mind, and I maybe don't study their mannerisms, but at least for speech patterns, I
Mhm.
keep it in mind, and I feel that it kind of helps me at least to separate out dialogue and make each person sound unique because you have a
Yes.
pattern of speech in mind, and not, you know, not to copy obviously them directly, but it just helps to have a real voice in your head
Oh
rather
yeah.
than your own voice saying these
Yeah.
lines, right?
I
Yeah.
I did for Adele, Celine from the Underworld series. You know, I really
Nice.
just watched her movements and her body language, and I just kind of used that to role model for Adele's reactions and character behaviors.
Well, that's great. That makes me even more excited for the book. And what a great excuse to rewatch Underworld.
Oh, yeah, right?
Like you need another excuse. Those are great. I love that movie.
They are such a great series of movies. I hope they make more.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do with with every all the series they're continuing now. Um, so I know you've got this. I know this series is kind of probably taking precedence for the next, you know, half a year to a year, whatever your publishing schedule looks like. Is there other are there other projects that you're currently working on? What can your readers expect from you next?
Well, I'm currently working on book two, in the drafting phase, and
Okay.
then just brainstorming book three. I at least want to, you know, have an outline before I finish drafting two. I want to have an outline for three. That way I don't miss anything in any of the story. But I also
Yeah.
have been brainstorming a reader magnet for this series. So I'm
Okay.
hoping to have that done by the end of the year. So,
Excellent. I look forward to that. Well, we are kind of to the end of our interview, so it's time for my last and favorite question of the day. This is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. Can you tell me about how, in a parallel universe, a different choice might have shaped another version of your life? This could be based on an actual path you've considered or something you've only dreamed of. The possibilities are infinite.
this is a tough one. Because, you know, as much as I love my life and my family and kids, I did live in California for a bit and I did take some acting classes and,
Oh,
you know, I was like, oh, doing some acting. So it would have been interesting to see if I had continued to pursue that road.
yeah. That's fantastic. I think, you know, I did. I mean, I didn't get that far, but it's definitely something, you know, in high school. I'd be like, well, that would be something fun to do.
Yeah. But then I'm
So,
not very good at speaking in public. So then I was like, this isn't for me.
well, you did a great job talking with me today. I definitely have enjoyed having you on the show. Um, can you let our listeners know where they can find you?
Yes, I mainly live on Instagram. I do have a Facebook page, but you can always find me on Instagram at kgrimes.writes. And I've recently joined Threads. I'm on the Cool Kids Club, so we'll see if Threads still exists when all this happens. But I am on TikTok, but I'm not really on TikTok. I don't dance and do all those kind of videos because that's not me. But yeah, Instagram.
Wonderful. Well, I will make sure to link all of that in the show notes. And you've recently started your own podcast, is that right?
Ah, yes. Me and A.E. Kincaid, Megan J. Dahl, and then we have two readers because our podcast name is the pens and the bookmarks. So we have the writers and the readers come together and we discuss, you know, the bookish industry from both sides. And Lou and Whitney are so fantastic. So we have lots of fun. We only do one a month because we're all moms and we're all crazy busy and but we have a good time when we get together.
That's awesome. And such a fun concept as well.
Thank you.
Definitely check, yeah, so definitely check that podcast out. I will link that in the show notes as well. Once again, thank you very much for joining me today, Kimberly.
Thank you for having me, Herman. This is very nice, and I will definitely hound you to come back when book two comes out.
You're very welcome. Please do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Kimberly Grymes. Please tune in next week when I talk with Anna Mossacat. Anna is an author of cyberpunk books, and we talk all about that subgenre, what you can expect from it, the tropes involved, and so much more. We have a great chat. I hope you'll join me then. Bye now. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the show, like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, you can help support the show by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can get early access to the show, as well as submit your questions for my upcoming guests. I hope to see you next time. Bye now.